Welcome to the Flux, where we hear stories from people who've asked what-if questions to better understand the world and talk about how data can help tell stories that impact decisions and create an intentional impact on the future. This is your host, John Cordier, CEO at Epistemics. In a world where the flux capacitor from Back to the Future does not yet exist, people have to make difficult decisions without always knowing how the future will play out. Our guests are people who've taken risks, made decisions when uncertainty was high, and who have assisted decision makers by using data and models. We hope you can turn lessons from our podcast into foresight so you or your organization can make better decisions and create an intentional impact for others.
Hello and welcome to the Epistemics podcast, where we're talking to experts who are using data to help people make better decisions. In this episode, I'm talking to Laura Sheppard, who is a research fellow at University College London's Centre for Longitudinal Studies about data mining. So, welcome, Laura.
Hello, nice to be here.
First of all, could you describe for people who've never heard of it, what is data mining?
So in my experience, data mining is all about having an unclean data set that's very much in its rawest form with useful information, but not necessarily the information we want for our research or for the questions we have. So I've always approached it as we extract the useful information that's within our raw data set to help us ultimately identify patterns and answer our research questions and kind of come up with something that's inherently quite interesting, but also not necessarily obvious at first glance, especially with new and kind of different forms of data that aren't necessarily what we'd traditionally use, I guess, for data science as well, and research. I guess with that as well, what I will say is I think people, when you say data, people think of numbers and massive spreadsheets with lots of numbers and that sort of thing on. But for me, I've used a lot of text mining as well. So maybe looking for certain phrases within the data, and then you can kind of infer specific information about things, or using things we'll probably talk about this a bit later, but using names to infer personal characteristics about people as well. So there's quite a lot of different options and different opportunities, I guess. Well, at least in my experience, there's been quite a lot of that as well. But I'm coming at it very much from an academic standpoint, but the data mining techniques I've used and other people use in academia can very much be used in the business corporate world, as well as think of the information social media companies have on us and what they can mine from our data as well. Is quite interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think one thing that was particularly interesting about our previous conversation was the idea that you can use data mining to access information within data sets that weren't originally designed for research purposes, and that there's value there that can be used for new purposes with a bit of creativity and application of data mining techniques to use it in new ways. Could you tell us a bit more about... Sorry, Laura.
No, I was just going to say, definitely. And I think with that, there was the case that, if you have a really interesting research question, there hopefully is some data out there that you can use that isn't necessarily, as you say, for research in its first purpose. There's a lot of data, and I think particularly what I've witnessed is a lot of people are kind of moving towards those new sources of data that aren't inherently for research. So it's really interesting, quite exciting area, I'd say, at the moment.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit about the work that you did with the British Library's Ethos dataset? Because I think this really connects to this point of this is something that was collected almost organically and then you've gone in and found ways of using it to address a really interesting and socially important question.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, and I'm sure not many people listening will know about Ethos. So the British Library's eThesis online service is a record of all doctoral study in the UK. So I believe there's about 98% of the doctorates that have ever been taken in the UK are within Ethos. So we could kind of call it like a census of doctoral students. This isn't a sample. This is nearly everyone. And so there's around, I think at the moment, around 625,000 records on Ethos. And what it does basically is it does its own sort of data mining. It scrapes new records from different universities, repositories, and puts the metadata to the kind of information about the thesis on Ethos. And that gives us a really rich source of metadata. So, for example, I recently finished my PhD. Not that it'd be on Ethos yet, but it would have my name, my full name, the year that I did the PhD, the university I did it at, the discipline, the title of the PhD, potentially my supervisors as well, the department, and so that's all the metadata that I kind of have on all these 625,000 theses. And this isn't just PhDs, there are other types of doctorates, the professional doctorates like clinical psychology doctorate, educational psychology doctorates, that sort of thing, that is also on there. So there's a lot of information about people doing really interesting research. And I think the thing with PhDs in particular is, although I will caveat this by saying some people have to publish during their PhD, which is the PhD by publication, but they're a much smaller number. So we have this amazing kind of source of data that people haven't really looked at because no one has to publish it. Yes, a lot of PhD students want to because that's a good way of communicating their research, but we have a lot of information about people doing really interesting stuff that then doesn't necessarily get out there to the world. So in terms of like the topic area, that's really interesting as well. But for me, my research and my areas of interest are very much on gender and higher education inequalities. And so Ethos really provides a great source of data that isn't really out there in other sources. So in the UK, we have the Higher Education Statistics Agency, and they have a lot of high-level statistics, about undergraduate students, postgraduate taught students, postgraduate research students, as well as staff in academia. And they, have posted it, but it's not on the kind of individual scale, it's not line by line like someone's individual information. And also in the UK, we have a funding body that funds around a quarter of PhD students. Actually, it's called UKRI, so it's UK Research and Innovation. And again, they publish like statistics on kind of the people, the PhDs that they fund, the different research grants they fund, etc. But because that's only a quarter of PhD students, we don't still get that kind of overarching, really big picture kind of information on people. So that's a kind of overview of Ethos. But what I will say is it's publicly available. So anyone can go to the British Library repository and download the data that I had, which is really interesting and actually a really interesting piece at the moment, especially with like open science and open research. And so, you could use my code and replicate my study. You could mine the data in a different way to me, but you can do a similar thing. And yeah, so in terms of my actual research, as I said, I wanted to look at gender inequalities, but Ethos doesn't have any personal characteristics of students. So there's no gender, category, there's no age, there's no ethnicity, there's nothing like that. And so what I did is I used the students' names in order to infer gender from that. And I also inferred a lot of, well, mined a lot of other information and a lot of other variables from what was publicly available. And what was also, I mean, because I was linked with the British Library during my research, I did get a little bit of additional data from them. But even from that, you know, that is a form of data mining in a lot of ways, because, you know, if I'm creating new variables, you know, linking ones together, maybe creating numerical percentage variables from text data that we have, like categorizing them in different ways from the raw data that I get given by the British Library and also that I download. My kind of end data set is very different to what I get originally. But in terms of the gender variable, there's a lot of services actually that you can use to infer gender. So they're called gender inferencing algorithms, and some examples, you can get them with encoding languages like R and Python, but you can also pay for services. So there's services such as Gender API, Genderize, NAMSOR as well, and these don't just do gender a lot of the time, like especially NAMSOR, they can do like ethnicity and nationality based on the names, which is an interesting one that I didn't explore too much, purely because of the scope of a PhD is often limited. You can't get ahead of yourselves. And so we did a validation as well on that to kind of test the accuracy of the names and what the algorithms were giving us. So definitely did a lot of due diligence around that. But unfortunately, the kind of the algorithm we ended up going for was called NAMSOR, and what was different about NAMSOR was they used someone's surname coupled with their first name in order to infer gender, which is really interesting, especially for our data set. So the UK PhD community is very international. So there's a lot of students from all over the world, which is amazing. And so what NAMSOR does is it takes the surname into account when predicting the gender for the first name. So a really good example that I often use if anyone asks is the difference between Andrea and Andrea. So for example, like Andrea probably in English would be a female name, whereas Andrea, spelled exactly the same, but potentially with an Italian surname, would more likely be a male. So that's really interesting. Thinking about that as well in terms of like how do you account for that when you're mining this data and when you're collecting this additional information.
How do you handle like genuinely gender neutral names even in English? Like for example, Lindsay.
Yeah, so actually some of the algorithms do take the year that the kind of record is associated with into account. So for example, names such as Lindsay, maybe they were more male, say around the 1900s, whereas probably in the 2000s they're more associated with female as well. So that can be taken into account. But also what these gender inferencing algorithms often do is they give you a score on like their confidence. So, you know, if the score is around, let's say, 0.55, they're probably not that confident on the prediction they're giving you. Whereas if it's around 0.95, amazing. You can probably take that with accuracy. And also what they often do is they have these really large samples of names that they draw from when they're predicting the gender from your sample. and they might give an N. So they might give like, oh, this is actually based off 100,000 people. We can be confident. So it's important to take that sort of thing into consideration as well. What it does do often is they only really predict female and male names. So if people have got like other gender identities, at the moment the algorithm's pretty poor in taking that into consideration. But it's worth also considering the accuracy that they give you. So for example, I would take out ones that were, I'd rather label a name as unknown than have it, around that sort of 50%, because it just didn't feel confident enough to me.
I think that like this really draws into focus how with a lot of these data science exercises, there is a level of artistry to making sensible assumptions and just being clear about what those assumptions are, presumably documenting them in your own PhD thesis that is presumably now in Ethos, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
And then, the idea that additional sources of data, such as the year in which the person was born, kind of naturally get folded into the exercise. As you start pulling on that thread, you find, oh, actually, in order to make sense of this, we need to pull in other additional sources of information.
Yeah, and I often think, people think, especially with quantitative research, which is what I predominantly do, people think it's very like hard lines, like it's very like the answers are very black and white. But in reality, there's a lot of nuance within data science, and as you say, there's a lot of like decisions that have to be made at different points. So, for example, some of the out of the sample, there were people that didn't have full first names. So obviously, like with Laura, instead of having Laura, it would have an initial, so it would have an L, which was then obviously difficult to infer gender because L could be anything, and what, again, this sort of, in terms of thinking about nuance, if they had a middle name, so actually to go back a step, the Ethos gives you the full name, so it would be Laura Sheppard, and maybe it would have my middle name, maybe it would just have the initial, and then I broke that down to create kind of last name, middle name, and first name. And if there wasn't, if we had an initial in the first name, could we then look at the middle name and infer a gender from that? And actually, out of the kind of the 60,000 or so records that had initials, which is, nearly 10% of our overall sample, isn't it? Like, it's quite a big amount. It was only around 1,000 to 2,000 that had the middle names that we could infer from. But even so, that provided a kind of extra level, an extra 1,000 or two records that we could kind of add in and be more confident on. But yeah, it was taking that sort of nuance to it that was important in the decision-making processes, especially for like the level of accuracy. We wanted to be confident in the results that we put out there. And so you've got to be careful, and you've also got to back it up with, your reasoning, like, why have you done these things?
Yeah. So save us from going into Ethos ourselves and reading the thesis. what were the sort of headline findings from this project?
So in terms of the kind of PhD community, the PhD landscape in the UK, there were quite a lot of very clear findings, both gendered and like more general findings. So, for example, the kind of highest awarding institutions in the UK for PhDs are Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, Imperial College London, and University of Edinburgh, which probably is unsurprising to people. Two really high, two really prestigious London universities, and you've got Oxford, Cambridge, and Edinburgh is a very old prestigious university in Scotland as well, so unsurprising there. And in terms of disciplines, I found that the highest awarding PhD disciplines include things like medicine and health, engineering and technology, the social sciences, physical sciences and also biological sciences. And even just from saying that, 4 of those 5 top PhD awarding disciplines are all STEM. They're all in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. And only one, the social sciences, is not within that. So that's important to bear in mind when thinking of like the gendered dynamics as well. So what I found in the gendered dynamics is there were the gender skewed disciplines were computer sciences, the physical sciences, engineering, mathematics, which if anyone knows anything about gender and education, you wouldn't be surprised. And then in terms of the female skewed disciplines at the PhD level, was arts and design, languages and literature, and also education.
Yep.
And we really see, especially within the physical sciences and engineering fields, very big gender gaps that remain. Even as the number of female students increases, so does the male student, but it doesn't really close. There's not been a lot of closing. And obviously that was worse in the kind of, so I didn't say earlier, but because of we had issues with with a lot of initials that we couldn't then infer gender for, we cut our sample at 1990. So it was a good sort of 30 plus years that we had. But the 1990s were predominantly a lot more male dominated than we see in, say, the 2010 period.
Right.
And then I guess also in terms of, because I was trying to think about it from like a geographical point of view, like a spatial point of view as well, we did look at specific places. So we looked at institutions that were kind of more male skewed or more female skewed. And for the female skewed institutions, the universities of Roehampton and Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. And for people that don't know about those universities, which to be fair, I didn't really either, Roehampton started off as 4 female teacher training colleges, which then amalgamated into a university. So it's really inherently like built around female education and teaching women to be teachers. And we also see in Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, they started off as their kind of home economics and domestic economy, I think is what they said, like for female education again. So it's really unsurprising that we still see these patterns coming through. And it's also very similar on the male institution side. So the most male skewed institutions for PhDs were the universities of Cranfield and Heriot-Watt. So Cranfield is like just outside London, in like Bedfordshire in the UK, and then Heriot-Watt is up in and around Edinburgh and in Scotland. And Cranfield was really set up as like aeronautics, aerospace engineering institution, which, as I've proved by disciplines, is really male dominated. And the same with Heriot-Watt. It was the world's first mechanics institute. So it's really interesting how we see these really disciplinary kind of entrenched patterns coming through when we look at gender skewed institutions.
So I can't imagine that Cranfield wants to be considered a male institution. So like it's curious, like what these findings can be used in terms of is the proportion of people who are doing a PhD or a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering greater than the proportion of people who do an undergraduate degree in a comparable discipline? Is the trend amplified the further down the pathway towards getting a PhD you go?
I think that really depends on the institution, because there are some, especially if we're thinking undergraduate, there are some undergraduate courses, like different universities, that would have a pretty gender balanced. So for example, like mathematics, there would be some universities that would have potentially 50-50 in their undergraduate population. But there would be some that maybe have like 20%, 30%. So it's really like dependent on their kind of admissions process, I'd say. Um,
Hmm.
and then for the PhD level, it's especially in these male-dominated STEM disciplines, it does kind of get narrower. Like it's not, you know, one woman in 10 necessarily, but there would be some departments that would be the case, unfortunately,
Hmm.
still. Um, but yeah, it's not easy solutions, and especially when we kind of take, say, the research pipeline, which is a
Hmm.
metaphor that is often used, much to its kind of negatives, but um, and it's becoming a bit more outdated. But anyway, we see like if we're going up all the way to like full professors, especially
Hmm.
in these male-dominated institutions, they'd be more likely, in my research experience, that there'd be more female PhD students than there will be full female professors, for example. Um, yeah, so hopefully, as the kind of these larger numbers maybe accumulate at the undergraduate and then
Hmm.
postgraduate level, they filter through, but there'll be a lot of things that need to change within the system in order to actually kind of facilitate that. Because at the moment in the UK, we only have, I think it's around 30 to 31% of the full professors in universities are female.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it's still pretty low.
That's interesting, especially in the context of your point around because Roehampton, for example, was female led. There's then a cyclical effect where it attracts more female
Mm,
students to study there, and then presumably some fraction of them are likely to become professors themselves. So it's the kind of thing that's going to be a decadal kind of shift in seeing these patterns, I would imagine.
yeah, and when I looked at, again, this is something, with data mining you can do, because if you have their year, you can put them into decades. So I did
Hmm.
that. So the 1990s was a lot more male dominated, and it was a lot higher, a lot lower chance rate of PhD students being female. I think it was around, 35%. Whereas when we look now in the most recent full decade, so the 2010s, um, we had, it was 44, 45%, I think.
Hmm.
So again, that's like you do sort of see that shift, and potentially in the 2000s, I think it was around 40. So it's interesting, it's sort of gone up incrementally. And when we get to the end of the 2020s, we can see if that has improved again. But recent statistics from the Higher Education Statistics Agency has put postgraduate researchers, it's around 51% female. However, that does include, it's not just PhDs, it does include research masters and professional doctorates as
Hmm.
well within that category. So it's not completely the same. It's not quite what I'm looking at, but um, it's very much moving in the right direction
Hmm.
from what I can see anyway. But there are very deeply entrenched disciplinary patterns that keep coming through wherever you look. Like
Got it.
across those 3 decades, the male skewed disciplines are the same in the 1990s as they are now. Um,
Hmm.
and it'd be the same for the female skewed ones as well.
Yeah, makes sense. I think this idea about repurposing publicly available data
Mm,
sets it's a good core idea. And I think it's something that there's a bit of overlap between your approach and what epistemics is currently doing around what we call our synthetic population, which
hmm
is an individual level representation of initially everyone in the United States. And we're trying to use it as a focal point for joining in other data sets. So
Yeah,
we've got a representation of how many people live in everyone's families and where does everyone in that family go during the day? Do they go to work? Do they go to school? But also then adding in health related data sets. Are they at risk of diabetes? What's the health insurance status? All of these
yeah,
kinds of things that together, the hope is that when people are developing models, so we focus on agent-based simulation modeling, but there's no reason why, if someone was interested in the statistical correlations between different variables that exist within the data set, that you could go, okay, well, in this case, it's useful to know the gender and the age that they were when they submitted their PhD thesis. Maybe at some point that would be useful as a starting point to start to build up a statistical picture of how these things are linked together. And again, most of the information that we're incorporating is the data initially is publicly available, but the value comes from finding the ways of joining it up and just making it available in a single repository that people can access in one place.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it would have been, really great if we could have, say, got information from these different statistical agencies, say on someone's undergraduate status. So like when they did their undergraduate doing, and could we match that in? Because I think when you have those kind of multiple data sets that you can link, there becomes more power, doesn't it? And you can do a lot. And I think hopefully I've demonstrated that you can do a lot from one data set, especially when it's, there's over 600,000 individuals on it. Like you can get a really good idea of stuff. As you say, it's when you can link it together and what can you kind of find from that and what data can you find and what variables can you create as well, and like what information and findings can that lead to. I think that's actually where there's a lot of power in data mining and tag mining approaches, definitely.
Yeah. The sum is greater, what is it? The total is greater than the sum of the parts?
I think it's that, yeah.
When you combine it together, yeah. Well, in terms of combining different data sets together, this reminds me of another project that you worked on for the Trussell Trust, where you're combining geographical data. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, so that was something that I did during my PhD research. And for those that don't know, the Trussell Trust network is a network of food banks in the UK. And so they have centres all around sort of the 4 nations of the UK that provide emergency food parcels to people who need them. And that came from a personal interest on volunteering at a local food bank, but also, the opportunity to do something a bit different whilst doing my PhD research. So I took a 3-month break and did a research assistant role within my department, but working very closely with people in the strategic team at the Trussell Trust. And that was really looking at accessibility and high levels of accessibility and demand for food banks. Have we got places that have got very high demand, and then also low accessibility to the current kind of food bank network that we see? And I think this kind of very much plays into what we're talking about in terms of those combining data sets, because we use great information from the web on locations of independent food banks as well as Trussell food banks to look at where they were. And once we've got someone's address, we can it's quite easy. It's a few lines of code to get their kind of point location, so get their latitude and longitude, and we can map it. And from that, we can then we can calculate travel times and distances between where people live and where these food banks are. And so if, for example, you live somewhere and it's an hour's drive to your nearest food bank, realistically, do you have a car or do you have access to a car? But also, like, how far is that walk? Can you get a bus there? And does that then prevent you from using these services? So we looked at different examples, and it was an interesting exercise, definitely, in combining data. So we used a lot of census data. So the UK had a census in 2021, and there's a lot of factors, within that we can see, levels of deprivation, different kind of housing scenarios, different, do people work? How much do they work? Not necessarily income, but that's, that sort of thing. To predict, where's this high accessibility? And then also, predict where this low demand is and where do we potentially need food banks for the future, especially as in the last few years, the most recent data from Trussell, that over 3 million people, or over 3 million food parcels rather, are given out in the UK. And that's not even looking at independent food banks that do a lot of the other kind of side to it. So it's a real kind of hidden food poverty. Well, not hidden, but yeah.
Well,
so it's
not
really
necessarily
interesting.
apparent. So
Not
like you
necessarily
can
apparent if you
uncover.
don't. Yeah, exactly. So that was a really interesting exercise. And as I said, like initially, what did I have? Oh, I had the census data that would probably predict that high demand. But what about the accessibility? You need to do a lot of data mining actually for that. Even if it is just a few lines of code, you need to get the data, you need to clean the data. You need to then, once you've kind of got the postcodes, can you link it to other sort of geographies, so like their local authorities or their regions or their country, and then how do we visualize this and how do we present this to people? And then on the other side, like how you actually then calculate the travel times or the distances and all of that sort of stuff, and link it all together then with the traditional data that we have from the census, which is very robust, well studied, highly used, with this new data that I've created from originally not very much,
Yeah.
But again, that's a kind of example at the moment of, I think a lot of people are looking for these new sources of data and being like, there's an important question to answer here. How can I answer it?
Yeah.
And don't give up just because you don't have the data initially, I guess.
Yeah. And, it's exciting as a data scientist that if you focus on a particular problem and then just start thinking, well, what information is available for me to start addressing this? Often there is something that no one else has done before that you can do to start making a difference. So yeah, I think as a field, that's something that's very exciting, and there's some optimism there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is the case within academia and also outside academia. Like obviously I'm still currently within academia and doing kind of research in universities, but there's a lot of other people out there, as you described, doing a lot of similar stuff with these new forms of data and using similar techniques, just for a different outcome, I guess.
Yeah. So Laura, I'm mindful of your time, but as you mentioned that you're still in academia, would you like to talk about what you're currently working on?
Yeah, so very early stages, only a couple of months in to my new job, first one post PhD. But I'm kind of taking this educational inequality side further and working in the Centre for Longitudinal Studies on educational attainment and genetic and environmental factors using longitudinal data, so cohorts of people of the same age, and can we track them over their life course? So different forms of data, but again, I'm sure there'll be a lot of data mining, and variable creation and all sorts of new methodologies to kind of develop and also use. So yeah, that'll be so far interesting and challenging. So a new challenge after PhD, which is always fun. Yeah.
Good. Yes. My new challenge after my PhD was joining epistemics, which has also been challenging and interesting. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, Laura. This has been fascinating. Right. And I thank you very much for speaking to us.
Yeah, that's great. I've really enjoyed it. It's nice to share some academic research on a wider scale. So, yeah, great.
It's great to hear it. Thank you.